Hey guys, this is Tho Bishop with Radio Rothbard, and I want to let you guys know about the first Mises event of 2024. On February 17th, we will be returning to beautiful Tampa, Florida for an event dedicated to inflation, causes, consequences, and the cure. While the government tries to hide the consequences of inflation in their official statistics, Americans see and feel it every time they visit the grocery store. The state and its media lapdogs try to blame inflation on corporate greed, but the true source of inflation is the Federal Reserve and the banking system. We're going to be tackling this issue with a great lineup of speakers, including Joseph Salerno, Patrick Newman, and our new Mises president, the great Tom DeLorenzo. We have a special code for Radio Rothbard viewers for a 15% discount. That's Rothbard24. And you can find more about this event at Mises.org/Tampa 2024. Hey guys, this is Tho Bishop with Radio Rothbard, and we've got another great offer for Radio Rothbard listeners. We have a free book that we want to send directly to your doorstep. If you are a fan of this show, you have no doubt heard us discuss Murray Rothbard's classic Anatomy of the State, his dive into the mechanics of the state as we know it, what the state fears, what its greatest threats are. It is one of the all-time best Rothbard reads, a personal favorite of both myself and Ryan. You can get your free copy as a Radio Rothbard listener by visiting Mises.org/RothPodFree. That's ROTHPOD free. You can also find the link in our show notes.
Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm executive editor at the Mises Institute. And with me, of course, is Tho Bishop. And we're going to talk this week about some things that states can do to hamstring and hamper federal power going into the new year. In a lot of states, of course, the state legislatures begin their sessions in the first couple of weeks of January. For the states that have proper legislatures that only meet a few months a year, or maybe even every other year, that's going to be happening now. Not like those awful states like California and New York that have year-long legislative sessions. But in a lot of states, now is the time for all you state legislators thinking out there to put together some good legislation. So Tho and I are going to try and give you some ideas here today. But before we get going on that, you want to talk about the Texit thing a little bit, Tho? I mean, this is a state issue, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I've gotten some good feedback from state legislators out there that are Radio Rothbard fans. That's always great to hear from. And yeah, one of the big stories out there, there's still a process that goes on to make sure that it actually gets on the ballot, legally. But it is the Texas nationalist movement that has been building steam for quite a while. There was some polling after the 2020 election that showed particular support for secession, especially among Republicans throughout the Southeast and parts of the kind of North Midwest. And this has helped propel this movement, which collected over almost 100,000 signatures with the goal of having the question of Texas secession being put on the Republican primary ballot next year. There are, of course, as you might suspect, some detractors from that. The Speaker of the House in Texas is particularly awful. The state party apparatus is actually really pretty good relative to other state parties out there. There's been a lot of support amongst sort of the grassroots of Texas Republicans to try to get this issue to the table. So the signatures have been filed. There's still a process to kind of you have to go through the signatures and make sure you don't have Mickey Mouse signing on things. And once the actual legal numbers are there, then it is quite possible that you're going to have millions of Texas Republicans having the opportunity to vote on whether or not Texas should continue to be a state. Now, this is a non-binding referendum, right? There's no automatic, enforcement mechanism to it. We're not going to immediately have 49 states and create all sorts of interesting issues that would come with that, with the 2024 election and the like. It'll, of course, be very interesting to see if the secession strength is there, if polls show that the politician of their choice is doing much better in 2024. But just the fact that we might actually have on the table the ability for voters to actively question the value of continuing to be a part of this federal government, I think is a very interesting story and a very important one for the discourse going into not just 2024, but whatever might come afterwards, as it helps normalize a topic that is, of course, near and dear to your heart. As the author of Breaking Away, a great book out there for anyone that hasn't gotten their copy. You can get a discount code for Christmas using Rothpod as a coupon code at the Mises bookstore. Got to get that commercial in there. But again, regardless of the outcome here, the fact that this is actually it has the potential of being on the ballot, being a part of the political narrative for 2024, just as a shot across the bow. I think these are the sort of moves that hopefully we'll see coming more and more from states, given the complete dysfunction and breakdown of Americans' quality of life thanks to the parasitic federal government.
Yeah, I don't see a real downside to running this sort of thing and forcing the party apparatchiks to tolerate it and let the vote take place. I think it gives a better idea of how the party rank and file feel about it. Well, I don't know. Do the sort of people who vote this thing, do they count as the rank and file? But at least the sorts of people who choose the candidates at the primary level and a lot of the state caucuses and the state parties and are at the state conventions and that sort of thing. These are the people who are really paying attention. They're often a lot of the time the people who send in funding. And so why not have people have some record, some public record of how many people support the idea? Now, I think Texas is the place to start. Texas is probably the place that has the most local nationalism, if you will. A lot of other states, there's just not much going on at all in terms of separatism. But and that includes most of the South, would be my guess. Texas is a little bit different. And part of that's because Texas is so huge and so it could so obviously be its own functioning polity from day one. I mean, with 25 million people, with a huge economy, with coastline, with plenty of oil and gas, all that sort of stuff. And so just on practical level, there's not even really any good objections to Texas being its own country, except just regular old brute force from Washington saying, hey, we want your tax revenue, you're not allowed to leave. So, yeah, why not do it? I mean, I know that the people who lead the party hate this sort of thing. And the fact that they hate it makes me like it more. And I think the left figured out a long time that a lot of these symbolic sorts of votes can serve a good purpose. It puts you on the map. It lets people know that this is something that isn't going away, that you can't ignore. And then if it ever gets to the point where it appears actually on ballots for the general population, that can be very useful as well. For example, look at how many times they ran in many states marijuana legalization ballot issues that failed. And it was only after several tries in states like Colorado that it finally passed. And then the same was used in a variety of other states as well. And then eventually it just, people got used to it and it started to get more acceptance. And really, I mean, let's face it, the pro-marijuana side won. It's most states now have at least medicinal marijuana, and over 20 states have it for recreational. I mean, this is clearly a winning strategy that can work. It's a grassroots strategy, and of course, the party leaders tend to hate it. So why not go ahead and try it? And yeah, so I think the fact that it isn't binding isn't really a criticism of it. I would be very curious to see how it turns out. So sure, this, of course, would not qualify as legislation. And as you know, it wouldn't actually change the legal landscape much, but it changes the political landscape going forward. And you have to be in for it for something more than a 2-year cycle if you're hoping to win this kind of game. And I think the people who are running this probably have some sense of that.
And of course, the gamble here is that if it's on the ballot, I think it's completely wiped out in a Republican referendum, right? If it's 2080, then that probably would not be a positive step for the Texas nationalist movement. And that's one of actually arguments that the group has made, is that, why are you guys trying to, against politicians trying to prevent this from being considered at all? It's like, look, if this thing fails as spectacularly as you guys would like us to believe, right? If this is such an outlandish idea, an irresponsible idea, whatever dismissive phrase that you want, if that is true, then the voters can show that, in which case we're going to have to take a big step back and reconsider our place with things. Now, what will be interesting is that even if it doesn't pass, but if it's 40, 60, if you have a large percentage of Texans, Texas Republicans, that are open to this idea, then that will, I think, go a long way, even without success, of helping normalize this process. You mentioned marijuana referendums. It's worth reminding listeners that it was 7 years between gay marriage being shut down, losing a California statewide referendum in 2008, between that and the Obergefell decision, right? And that referendum, the California referendum on gay marriage, it failed, fairly, by limited narratives and margins there. Obviously, that it continued the conversation in other states. You had other states kind of pursuing that, and then all of a 7 years later, you had this massive change within a historical institution with the United States as a part of a Supreme Court decision. Now, I have a feeling that the Supreme Court is never going to be nearly as open to the question of secession as they are on certain progressive cultural issues there, but it just shows how quickly this landscape can start, and how even a ballot referendum that fails does not necessarily mean the end or the death of a political cause.
Yeah, and there is a point to be made in terms of, yes, if you bring forth a issue for the ballot and it fails horribly and repeatedly, that doesn't help you much. And so there is that issue to be aware of. And that happened in Colorado with anti-abortion issues, where there was a group here that kept running these anti-abortion pieces of legislation that would, for example, legally define an unborn child as a legal person and that sort of stuff. But those failed miserably. And all they did end up doing was giving politicians in the legislature confidence, knowing that they could pass pro-abortion legislation without being punished at the ballot box, at least not at the statewide level. So there can be a downside to that. But if you, as you say, if you really think it would fail miserably, then the party leaders in the GOP should want to run this. But they seem to be concerned that it might actually do reasonably well. So that's just an interesting sign. Right there. So yeah, I hope they determine that it'll be worth it to do it, and that they get at least 40%, maybe, heck, maybe even 35%. You can say more than a third want to secede. That's not terrible headlines. If I saw a big giant national poll that said 30% of Americans think that everybody has the right to secede, I think that would probably be good. I think we're currently at about a quarter. The last time I saw a poll on that. The Zogby polls have actually been fairly positive if you're pro secession in recent years. So it's not as much of a fringe idea as its opponents would have you believe. But let's see how that goes in Texas. Well, let's look at some actual legislation then. Here's some ideas for you legislators. Let's just start off with the order that they're written here. Defend the Guard legislation. Now, we've brought this up a little bit in the past. This could take a variety of different forms, but the general premise is to prevent each state's National Guard from being shipped off to foreign countries just because the president has unilaterally decided that the United States is at war with country X. And the way it's been happening in the last 20, 30 years is that the president decides, hey, I don't like that foreign country or some foreign leader, whatever. I don't even really have to consult Congress. I just decide I'm going to send troops to fight this war. And the next thing you know, you're in the National Guard. You're a dog groomer, and you've got a National Guard obligation. Then they ship you off to the Middle East for a few months or more. and you just hope that your mortgage is all working out by the time you get back. So that's a terrible idea, and really betrayal of what the National Guard is supposed to be about. And so it's nice to see that there's some legislation in those terms. Now, though there are some variations on this, though, if I remember correctly, and there's different states that have actually been running this legislation. I think I saw that Maine was doing it, and I think one of the original was a legislator named McGeehan out of West Virginia, and there have been some other states as well. Do you remember where some of these other states are?
Yeah, there's been significant movement in states like Arizona. I know Florida has had, it is on passing Florida, but there's been Anthony Sabatini, who was a very firebrand state rep. Even after he left the state house, that baton continued to be passed afterwards, and that's always very important because sometimes you'll have a very good state legislator that is motivated by some of these issues, and whenever they leave office, in Florida we have term limits and the like, it kind of dies with them. But this is one of those issues that you see a lot of overlap with a lot of like America First, sort of MAGA style Republicans have been leaning into this sort of legislation. Wendy Rogers, who's one of the kind of like Queen MAGA, queen of the Trump delegation within Arizona, as a state senator there, she has been one of the leading advocates within that state. And so this is one of those issues where you see a lot of getting that America First MAGA sort of crowd out there, willing to introduce at the state level. It is something that has a lot of grassroots organization with both our friends in the Libertarian Mises Caucus, Republican Liberty caucuses out there that are kind of the remnant of the Ron Paul Guard as an organizational entity within the Republican Party. So this is one of those issues that you see really nationwide, state level organization supporting, and that is it's given the continual the concerns, particularly with the Russia-Ukraine conflict in particular, that continues to motivate Republicans in D.C. and elsewhere of not giving up non-interventionist principles and some of the gains that have been made there. This is one of those ways in the state legislature where you see Republicans being able to kind of tie in national issues, kind of national skepticism of foreign policy attached to their state national guards in a way that's relevant to the state legislative level. So this is one of the, there's perhaps few issues that have been able to really take on a life of its own, quite like Defend the Guard in recent years.
And the actual form of the legislation, from what I've seen, is usually a prohibition on sending National Guard troops outside the U.S. unless Congress has formally declared war on state X. Now, there are other variations on this that you could do. You could go back to how the legislation of the National Guard was originally written. And the National Guard really only started existing in something resembling its current form after 1903. Before that, it was simply state militias. It's still technically the state militia, but it's been brought under the Pentagon. So the Pentagon basically has a say in almost everything now, the Guard does. And then in the 80s, thanks to anti-communist members of Congress, they removed the state veto, because up until that time, state governors often had a veto on troops being sent overseas. And this came to a head in the 80s when they were trying to send National Guardsmen to help dictators in Central America. And so some governors tried to prevent that from happening. And then all these quote unquote patriotic members of Congress decided to shred federalism a little bit more by removing that veto that state governors had on where members of their National Guardsmen National Guards were sent. And that, of course, you might remember if you were at risk of being sent to Vietnam, if you're in that age group, or maybe your father encountered this issue where he could join the National Guard and avoid being sent to kill and burn Vietnamese villages. in Southeast Asia. And I've met quite a few men who have done that, often liberty-loving men who didn't want to kill for the regime. So they just joined their state's National Guard. Now, the smarter guys were able to do that early on in the conflict. The dumber ones, like George W. Bush, only tried to join later, and they needed their dads to pull some strings to get them in the National Guard to avoid military service. But that was the status quo back then, was that the Guard was not sent overseas to fight in these international wars. So you could introduce legislation that would try and move these National Guard laws back in the direction of where they were in the past when they were better. But you would probably meet insane amounts of opposition from the Pentagon. In fact, all versions of these bills meet huge opposition from the Pentagon. They send generals to your office as a state legislator to threaten you. They tell the state that we'll withdraw all funds from your state and it'll cost you jobs and we'll badmouth you every chance we get. The military basically declares itself the enemy of your state if you threaten to take control of the Guard and not let the Pentagon and the White House decide where your local troops are sent. But that is something you can do as a legislator, and it has been tried in a variety of states, and it often does get up for committee. It gets voted upon. It failed in Wyoming recently because even though you'd think Wyomingites who correctly hated Liz Cheney on that, and threw her out, nevertheless can't bring themselves to assert any real federalism in opposition to federal power on this issue. So there's still a lot of work to be done there, but it's certainly the sort of legislation that we want to continue to see brought up in states year after year. Now, with the next issue, states holding gold on balance sheets. Now, this I don't know a whole lot of. I know states have taken some steps to make precious metals legal tender in some places, and to really, and to reduce taxes on sales and make it function as actual money. But what's the story here with the balance sheets, though?
It was interesting. If you look at kind of the statutes that different states have on what they can invest any surplus funds in, as part of their investments that they might hold for, pension funds or the rainy day fund and things like that. I know here in Florida, for example, one of the ways these state investment funds have been utilized in recent years have been dealing with woke businesses and BlackRock and things like that, right? So you've had different states. I think West Virginia was the first one to do so with their state treasurer of divesting any of their state-held assets from, say, like BlackRock or DEI funds and the like. But if you look at the statutes and what they're allowed to invest in, states like Florida, for example, you can invest in government bonds. You can invest in certain types of stock. You can invest in Israeli debt. One of the few foreign investments that you can make using state funds. There's some political aspects that go into that, but gold is not one of those. And so, if we look at a state like Texas, as we mentioned earlier, that's an example of a state that's been the most proactive in. They've created a gold depository and the like, and you could theoretically envision a situation where if you have a state like Arkansas, for example, that legalizes the ability to invest in gold as an asset, having that as an inflation hedge, rather than investing in, say, government securities and the like. Even if they do not themselves have the custodial capacity as a state yet to actually have a secure facility for physical gold holdings, why can't they contract out with a state like Texas that has the facilities already in line? And so you could vary if there is interest among state legislators concerned within this inflationary environment, concerned with this heightened awareness of concerns about monetary policy, decreasing demand for U.S. Treasuries and the like. It would be very interesting if you start seeing multiple states contracting with a state like Texas to, I would never expect for all of their holdings, all their savings to be placed in gold, but start accumulating those as simply an additional aspect of the larger portfolio, which would not only, I think, make economic sense within some of the headwinds out there, but that itself would be a very big shot across the bow. That'd be a very big statement piece against kind of a no confidence vote on the direction of the U.S. Treasury. And so that leads a very interesting dynamic. If we tie this back into the state secession issue, is that if Texas were to become an independent state, it would immediately have more gold on hand than Canada. So another point in favor there of Texas statehood. But I think these are some of the conversations, and I've had conversations with a variety of state legislators who are very interested in trying to apply, their concerns about the Fed and monetary policy into actionable legislation at the state level. This, I think, is an important one that hasn't really gotten traction yet, I think, out there, but one that I would like to see more states start looking at as an aspect of kind of taking a more responsible look at what the next decade or so might be bringing.
And so for any of those, and of course you often hear from some of the more newcomer libertarians who they think in certain sorts of terms about how, well, right, you can't do anything that actually increases either state or federal power. In this case, it's still a slam dunk, because what you're doing is opening up the available number of investments that can be made as a property owner in these cases. Or in terms of, well, I guess when we're talking about states doing these sorts of investments also, or state agencies, it also enables more private firms then to participate just in that economy as well. So, I mean, I just don't see like a problem here with expanding state regulation. If anything, it seems that it pulls back state regulation. Now, looking at the next issue here, let's look at the ban on CBDCs. This should be a slam dunk too, where you're preventing a government bank, the central bank, from forcing the use of CBDCs in your jurisdiction. And this, of course, CBDCs, the central bank digital currencies, are among the greatest threats to human liberty that we see out there right now. And of course, the central bank would love nothing more than to make it so that everybody has to use these, so that the central bank can monitor every dollar you spend, can prevent all bank runs by making it so that dollars can never actually leave the banking system and go into private hands. And so it's quite remarkable how far that's already come. They, of course, always keep saying, "Oh, well, we're just researching it. We're not going to actually do it." Just like they used to say about vaccine requirements to to go places or to work places. This is something that certainly they would love to have, and it would seem that by banning its use within the state is a nice blow that you can strike against the central bank, and making it clear that there's real political opposition there.
Yes, and Florida was, I believe, the first state to do this. This was part of Governor DeSantis's kind of shadow campaign last legislature on really trying to hit some national relevant issues within kind of a state agenda. But a good thing, I think. And it has been growing in appeal. North Carolina has passed similar laws. I believe Iowa has done the same. And so this has become, I think one of the positive aspects of the current, one of the only positive dynamics of the current political conversations out there is how mainstream the risk of CBDCs have become. It's something that, now it's one of the go-to, boogeyman headlines that Fox News will run with on occasion. So I think at the very least, we've kind of won the battle from a propaganda standpoint of Americans recognizing that while they might not pay that much attention to the Fed or monetary policy or the question of what is money at a very basic level, they recognize that central bank digital currencies are a very specific and sinister tool as part of this broader World Economic Forum globalist sort of agenda there. And so that's a step in the right direction. And this also goes to, and this kind of goes into the previous topic, is how some of these the role of, say, your state treasurer or state chief financial officer or some of these tools that the states have dealing with financial services, dealing with investments, dealing with laws on money and the like. Some of these things that we don't often kind of think of them as sexy positions, but these are where a lot of kind of the rubber meets the road in dictating how states operate and the like. And so whether it is, again, taking a more activist approach in terms of the investment of funds, whether it is trying to create bulwarks within the state level about the imposition of central bank digital currencies. And this is one of those issues that has broken through state governments, where it's a lot easier to be a lot more bold and, let's put it bluntly, useful on pro-liberty legislation. This is something that has actually made its way to DC as well, where Tom Emmer, who is not a particularly good congressman from a liberty perspective by any means, he's the whip for the Republican side, someone who shortly had, I think, a three hour long span of Speaker of the House dreams during that whole theater a month or so ago. He's actually been the co-sponsor or the sponsor of this at the federal level. So again, this is the example of one of the few issues that we're going to talk about that is not only restrained to state level conversations, but has actually been able to break through to the federal mainstream, which again, I think goes to the political potency that the risk of CBDCs has had within this broader political discourse.
Let's see. So, yeah, it would. Oh, by the way, it says here that South Dakota adopted some legislation banning CBDCs as well. And what was an interesting kink to that piece of legislation was that they were rewriting legislation that had been in the works that would allow central bank digital currencies, but would disallow anything like Bitcoin or private cryptocurrencies. So it was a it was a two shot by the people who favor tyranny, basically try to say, here, the only digital currency you can use is the government controlled stuff. And so fortunately they picked up on that there and have taken steps to do the reverse and prohibit CBDCs while allowing private crypto, which is of course the way it should be. Next is states can adopt legislation to require banks to notify customers if the IRS investigates their activities. Now, this has been getting worse for decades in terms of your bank basically spying on you. The feds have required this. Banks don't like to mention it because it makes their customers annoyed. And in the 90s, probably one of the biggest gains was the Know Your Customer legislation, which is in the mid-90s, and which essentially created a lot of this new wave of legislation for the last 25 years about how, well, if you do this transaction or that transaction, your bank has to report you to the federal government. And of course, there was some of that or even before that. And then, as you can imagine, that accelerated far more after 9/11 in 2001 and has really only been getting worse since then. But now we're hearing more and more about how the IRS is going to investigate all your Venmo purchases or any money that you have coming in through Venmo. Of course, the Pentagon loses a few $1 trillion and fails multiple audits in a row, has no idea where its money is, wastes it who knows where. But if you receive a few $100 for mowing a lawn through your Venmo account, you better report to the IRS or you'll be investigated. So this just seems to be a growing trend. And it says here that Florida had already done this for Florida chartered banks. So how does that play out?
Yeah, so this is something I have to give kudos to Jimmy Petronas, who's our chief financial officer, who, again, is one of those people that have kind of utilizing the role of that position in a way a lot more creatively than many have in the past. And so what legislation that he helped drive with the state legislature that did pass, it was on the heels of the massive expansion of the IRS powers. And basically, if you are a bank chartered in Florida, and if you have if the IRS or any federal agency goes to the bank trying to get information about their clients, which we've seen as an issue massively expand in recent years. We saw this play out in a big way after the January 6th protests, where Bank of America was going to the feds and giving customer information without even being solicited for. It's like, oh, here, hey, friends, here, you might want to check these people that were using their credit cards around the Capitol on January 6th. Go vet those folks. We've seen, a topic that we've hit on a number of times on Radio Rothbard, right? This weaponization of the dollar, the weaponization of money in banking, this as the next frontier of authoritarian governance. Here you actually have a piece of state legislation where, and I believe that the Florida laws only apply to Florida chartered banks, not other banks. So that also kind of creates a dynamic of kind of helping breed more federalism in the financial system, right? So if you have additional security protections that come from going to a Florida chartered bank as opposed to a nationally chartered bank, then that could help spur customer behavior in a way that could be beneficial as well. But basically, it creates a dynamic where, again, if you are a customer of these banks and the IRS is kind of snooping around, then it will alert you. The bank has an obligation to alert you that the IRS is doing this. Additionally, the CFO office here has actually created a fund for sort of public defenders, so that if you are, particularly if your Venmo is being audited or things like that, and you can't afford a very powerful sort of tax attorney or the like, they actually have a program that will help you deal with the IRS if they are, snooping around things and the like. And so again, for one, this is important from the state perspective of recognizing that the IRS, that the federal DC are not your friends, right? This is not just good old Uncle Sam making sure that you pay your civil fair share as a good citizen should, but rather it starts from a position of recognizing it as the aggressor, recognizing it as an antagonizing force, and then trying to create some protection, some customer protections at the state level that can, at the very least, alert you, bring more transparency in the process, so they cannot do this without your knowledge of it. Now, we'll see how this plays out over time. The effectiveness of it, right? That's always a valid. When we see government action, we kind of having a nice piece of legislation, a secondary from it being enforced in practice and the like. But I think this is another sort of dynamic where, again, having states operate from the perspective of suspicion of the motivations of the feds, and then actively utilizing the resources the state has to create protections and to anything that creates tension between that public-private relationship that has become far too sinister, whether it is on the financial side, whether it is on the big pharma side, like our conversation last week with Dr. Gilbert Burdine and some of the state-driven legislation, or state-driven lawsuits over big pharma and the like. I think this is the sort of legislation that I think is very meaningful in terms of kind of embracing a soft secession, soft decentralization perspective, where it's baked within the framework of these state laws and regulations, a healthy dose of skepticism and hostility to what DC is doing, not simply being a willing partner, being an enthusiastic vassal state to DC, but rather taking their role of state sovereignty a lot more seriously.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think since the New Deal, states have functioned more and more as basically provinces of the federal government, and have really not shown any concern with protecting their own citizens against these encroachments from the federal government, and have helped federal agents generally prosecute and persecute their own citizens. And that brings us to this final issue, which is just nullification in general. Now, some people who think about this all day, they get really worked up about, are we talking about actually attempting to simply overthrow rules? They've got very specific definitions for what nullification means. They take it very literally in many cases in terms of 1798's nullification doctrine that Madison and Jefferson came up with, where the states would combine to actually overthrow federal legislation. I don't think you can do that at this point unless you get a bunch of states together. But when we say nullification, we simply mean states either refusing to aid any sorts of federal agents in the arrest, prosecution, or observation of citizens within a state that run afoul of federal law, or it's just a situation where the state simply refuses to recognize federal law as valid in this particular case and may perhaps contrary to state law. This perhaps applies then to marijuana laws within many states. Colorado probably had among the strongest of that early on, basically writing into the Constitution that no state agent or legislator or law enforcement officer could assist the federal government with their own prohibition laws against marijuana. And so that's proven incredibly effective. It's really actually helped to illustrate how federal agencies can't do a whole lot without assistance from state agencies, because even though the feds have tons of FBI agents, they're constantly trying to arm more heavily their own federal agents, whether it's IRS agents, Postal Service people, ATF, you name it. They're always trying to give those people more guns and more ammunition. But they still rely heavily on the sheriff, the local sheriff, local police forces, the state patrol, to round up people for the feds and put them in federal jails, or rather just put them in the local jails so they could be sent to federal court and then go to a federal prison. This all requires a lot of involvement from the state in many cases. And so nullification could be effectively used through that means. And I think you see that then in the war on drugs. And while Republicans are generally much more spineless on the issue, they have shown some spine on that with enforcing federal laws against guns in Missouri, especially, where there's been some especially strong legislation there saying that state agents will not help enforce federal gun control laws. And so there is some that can be done there, but it's very hard to find any Republican leadership that's willing to really invest much of anything into that, whereas Democrats have been fairly good and reliable on the drug war issue. Republicans have been extremely timid on any of their own issues, whether it's Obamacare, gun control, or anything else. So it looks like there's still a long way to go with that.
And one issue that this has become kind of a major deal is regarding gun rights. The state of Missouri passed a nullification law, basically nullifying all federal gun regulation that has been currently struck down by a lower federal court in recent months. The Supreme Court refused to take up Missouri trying to throw out that ruling. So I think there's going to be some more court action on that going forward. But gun rights has been kind of one of those areas where conservatives have set to kind of borrow from. I think that's the one issue where there has been, I think, the most political interest in sort of borrowing from the left's success when it comes to marijuana laws and the like. And obviously that's a big cultural issue. It's a very easy, kind of one of the easiest areas to go radical within a political campaign, a lot more so than other areas that require a little bit more explanation for certain voter groups there. And so I think that's going to be a continuing battle, particularly if we see any further action, on gun control in the future, which, given Trump's willingness to ban bump stocks and the like, I don't know if that's going to be something that is going to be off the table, regardless of the outcomes of the 2024 election. But it is interesting. It is good to see that nullification muscle still being at least entertained by some state legislators, and I think that's one that will continue to gain some momentum. And of course, another aspect to this, which is less reliant upon the non-commandeering doctrine aspect of kind of pure nullification, but rather state attorney generals and state governments trying to rein in various administrative state excesses from the federal governments can be seen in efforts dealing with environmental controls and wetland regulation alike. There's going to be a very important Supreme Court case next year that seeks to unravel or kind of take a major step back from the Chevron deference doctrine that gave a tremendous amount of rule writing powers to the agencies, expanding their powers well outside of the confines of the actual written legislation. And that aspect is going to, should the expected ruling there, given the current makeup of the court, while we've had conservative, quote unquote, courts in the past, the makeup of this court, particularly with Gorsuch, in particular, is one that seems to be particularly amenable to questioning some of the fundamental administrative state aspects of the federal government. And so should that ruling, which I believe deals with a fishery issue, should that ruling go the way that court watchers expect it to go, that will open up the table to a variety of different state lawsuits over environmental regulation, some of which might do with land itself. Some of it might have to deal with kind of emission standards and things like that. And so that is something where, again, not in a pure non-commandeering doctrine, you can't tell us how to enforce our law dynamic, but rather getting into the lawfare dynamic of federalism, that could open up a whole new battlefield on reining in some of these steps. And that's going to require, while I don't expect the feds to kind of just go quietly in the night should they get an unfavorable ruling, if that allows for serious agitation from state attorney generals, again, following the model like we've seen with, we've seen Ken Paxton in Texas taking on big pharma and various lawsuits. With similar dynamic with the Missouri case dealing with the federal government's involvement with censorship during COVID on social media platforms and the like, right? So, some of these state attorney general's offices willing to take a more aggressive stand, viewing the federal government as a hostile actor and trying to rein in some of these things. I think that we have a lot of opportunities, whether it's from the attorney general itself or whether it's the state legislature basically forcing the state attorney's office to take an aggressive stand there. We could be seeing in the next couple of years, should some of these court cases go the right way, a much more favorable environment for kind of a legal nullification from a lot of longstanding federal rules, regulations, and general sinister activities.
Well, and of course, if you attempt any sorts of these types of nullification measures, whether it's just refusing to assist the feds or actively trying to get in the way, you're going to get sued. I mean, the feds, they're not going to want to put up with it. So, of course, you're going to end up in federal court in many of these cases. It seems the only real surefire way that it ever works is when nullification just requires that you do nothing. Because in those cases, the state can just simply sit on its hands and refuse to enforce something or be real slow about enforcing things. And so a lot of it comes down to not just how the law is written, but to how much the locals believe in helping the federal government carry out its usually unconstitutional regulatory laws. And so there are issues that some states, I think, will be able to get on board with. Some issues where it requires that you do more. That's going to be harder to nullify. And so it is going to vary on which issue we're talking about, whether we're talking about, hey, we're just going to not enforce this particular law, or we're going to actually enforce, say, laws against abortion in this case. Now, of course, the federal law had been overturned on that. And had it not been, it would have been very difficult to do some sort of nullification there, because the feds just would have stepped in and done enforcement on their own. So there's a lot of gray area that's going to occur when you try and do any sort of nullification. You're going to get sued. The feds are going to try and make lessons of some people. So you're just going to need to be prepared for that. The only alternative, though, is to just go along with everything the feds want and to have no sort of resistance whatsoever at the state level. And then, of course, the feds always win. And they're going to bank on that going forward. So I think with that, we've covered everything. I think we've looked at some of these issues, and certainly interested in any new ideas that any of the states have about nullification or any of those issues. because sometimes some of these legislators come up with some pretty creative ideas. So we'll keep an eye out on those going forward. But certainly, I hope some states are thinking about ways that they can really try and get in the way of the feds and really maybe try and assert some of the freedoms that they were originally supposed to have within a federalist system, but in the last 150 years have really just given up as a matter of America first, unity, supporting the president, all that. So all those reasons that states have basically given up on actual balance of power in the Constitution and all of that, independence, freedom, all that stuff that's basically the opposite of helping the central government do things. So thank you for listening to this episode of Radio Rothbard. We will be back next week as we approach the end of the year, and so we will see you next time.